Welcome back. So in this last concept or in this last video in this chapter on loops, we are going through this concept of nested loops. Just like a nested if statement, a nested loop just means that it is a loop within a loop. So the section in blue is what we call the outer loop, and the section in green is the inner loop. Outer loop runs the green and purple sections 3 times, whereas the green one is just a normal loop running the purple statement 3 times. So when I is 0, because that's the first number that you will take, J will take the values 0, 1, 2, and finally stop when it reaches the value of 3. So in total, if we need to count the number of times that the purple line will run, we just need to take 3 times, because 3 minus 0 is 3, multiply by the number of times that the inner loop will run. So outer multiplied by inner. So 3 minus 0, 3 minus 0 is 3 times 3. That gives us 9 times. So if we look back at the table, which is something familiar to us, I takes the value of 0 to begin. J also takes the value of 0. And when these two are 0, they increase x by 1 from 0 to 1. So following that, I is still 0 because we haven't completed running the inner loop. J takes the value of 1. X again increments by 1. So as we can see, when I is 0, J has already completed 1, 2, 3 iterations, taking the value 0, 1, and 2. And we notice that it is only when J reaches its termination, meaning that it takes the value of 3, that we go back to the first line and increase I by 1. So that is when I increases 1 and J is now reset to 0. 0, 1, and 2. And finally, for I is 2, J takes the value of 0, 1, and 2. Every time that the loop or J runs, X increases by 1. And finally, after I completes 3 loops of J, when I is 2, it goes back to check, is I now 3? And that is when the entire nested loop stops. So nested loops can also be run using a while loop. It's just that we need to identify or initialize the value. So again, we've got I and J being 0. And as long as I is not equals to 3, keep running the inner section. Keep running the inner section. So the inner loop is the green and purple section. Outer loop is actually the blue section. Let's take a look at the code in Jupyter Notebook. So let's take a look at the nested for loop first. So we initialize x to be 0. And we can see that as we change the value for I, so if we change I runs from 0 to 4 times, how many times does this run? It will take 3 times for the inner loop, multiply by 4 times for the outer loop. And this gives us 12. Similarly, if we change the value for the inner loop, we can also change the number of times that this loop runs. What is important to note here is that whenever I increments by 1, you need to remember that this entire loop has run its course and from 0 until 4 once already. So if we go on to the while loop, we use a shortcut to initialize I, J, and X to the value of 0. And we start by initializing or indicating the condition for the outer loop to end. So the outer loop only ends when I is now 3. This becomes false and the entire loop ends. So when I is 0, we increase I by 1, so I becomes 1. And we initialize J to be 0. So J will run 3 times because this is what the inner loop is doing. So if we start by ignoring the outer loop, just concentrate on what the inner loop is doing. So if you see both in the for and the while loop cases, we focus only on the inner loop. We know that in the for loop section, the inner loop runs 4 times. In the while loop section, the inner loop runs 3 times. Then we actually start to take a look at the outer loop. Here, the outer loop is running from 0 to 4. So it takes the value of 0, 1, 2, 3. Every time I increments by 1, j would have completed 0 to 4. So that's how we look at it. Similarly, for the while loop, whenever we increment I by 1, j would have completed one entire cycle of 3 times. So if we run this, we also see that, if we run this, we see that x equals to 9, and we can change the number of times that the loop runs by changing some of these values. So I hope that's clear. Nested loops is not a simple concept. There will be more practice within your tutorial, and do check with your tutor. And so this brings us to the end of the lesson on loops. We have covered for loops, while loops, as well as nested loops. Proceed to the next lesson where we will learn about functions. Thank you.